Have you ever wondered why Venezuela prints money and their economy completely collapses, but the United States can print $9 trillion, equivalent to 40% of all dollars that have ever existed in history, in just 2 years and still remain stable? While Venezuelan citizens have to push wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, Americans can still buy the latest iPhone at relatively stable prices. This isn't magic. This is the most sinister conspiracy in human history. Today, I'm going to expose the truth that 99% of the world's population doesn't know: how the United States has turned the entire world into economic slaves to bear inflation for them. The story begins in 2020, when the Federal Reserve started implementing the largest money printing program in history. From March 2020 to December 2021, they printed nearly $9 trillion, a number your brain might not be able to comprehend. To understand how massive this number is, if you stack $9 trillion in $100 bills, it would be 9,000 kilometers high, 1,000 times taller than Mount Everest. But here's the scariest part. While the U.S. was printing money like newspapers, inflation in America only rose about 8 to 9% in 2022. This number, though high by normal standards, is completely disproportionate to the massive amount of money they just created. So where did all that excess money go? Who is bearing the consequences of this money printing party? The answer will make you angry and wake you up. Imagine you're playing Monopoly, but only one person is allowed to be the bank and print money. That's exactly the position of the United States in the world economy. Did you know that 60% of international transactions worldwide are conducted in US dollars? This means when you buy an iPhone from China, when Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, or when Brazil exports coffee to Germany, everything has to go through the dollar. This didn't happen naturally. This is the result of a carefully calculated plan from 1971, when President Nixon announced the abandonment of the gold standard. In 1974, after the oil crisis, the United States secretly signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia, the country with the world's largest oil reserves. The content of the agreement was simple but sinister. Saudi Arabia would only sell oil in US dollars in exchange for the US protecting the Saudi royal regime. Sounds harmless? This is the most brutal economic trap in human history. When Saudi Arabia, and later all of OPEC, only sold oil in dollars, what happened? All countries in the world were forced to stockpile dollars to buy oil. And what is oil? It's the blood of the modern economy. Without oil, you can't transport goods. Without oil, you can't produce plastics, chemicals, fertilizers. Without oil, modern civilization would collapse. But the story doesn't stop at oil. Over the past 50 years, the United States has gradually turned the dollar into the oxygen of the world economy. 88% of global foreign exchange transactions involve dollars. 59% of global foreign exchange reserves are dollars. And 40% of international trade transactions use dollars. The result? When the U.S. prints money, the whole world has to swallow that currency. When the Fed raises interest rates, other countries must follow. When the United States imposes sanctions, they can strangle any nation just by cutting off the dollar payment system. That's why they can print $9 trillion without fear of inflation. Now, to understand the mechanism of exporting inflation, you first need to understand what inflation really is. Inflation is not rising prices. Inflation is your money losing value. When there's more money in the system, but the amount of goods doesn't increase correspondingly, the purchasing power of money decreases. This is a basic economic law that even first-year students know. So why can the U.S. print 40% of total dollars in 2 years without suffering devastating inflation like Venezuela or Zimbabwe? Here's the truth they never teach you in school. When the Fed prints $9 trillion, these currencies don't just circulate within the United States. They're distributed around the world. Imagine the United States as a small pond, and $9 trillion as a massive amount of water being poured in. If the water only stayed in the small pond, it would overflow and cause flooding. That's inflation. But if this pond is connected to an entire ocean, that's the world. Then that amount of water would be dispersed without causing disaster. The ocean here is the other 195 countries in the world, all of which must use dollars to buy oil and raw materials, conduct international trade payments, stockpile foreign exchange reserves, and pay international debts. Here's the most cunning trick. After pumping money and exporting inflation, the Fed raises interest rates to suck dollars back. This process unfolds as follows. Step 1, from 2020 to 2021, the Fed prints money frantically, interest rates near zero, dollars flood the world. Step 2, from 2022 to 2024, the Fed begins raising interest rates from 0% to 5.5%, making dollars more attractive. Step 3, countries must raise interest rates to retain capital, putting pressure on their economies. Step 4, economic crises emerge in other countries, forcing them to sell assets cheaply to American big players. The result? The U.S. both prints money at no cost and buys world assets at bargain prices. That's why after every crisis, Americans get richer. So who is really bearing the inflation? The answer is the entire world. When you see gas prices in Vietnam rise from 15,000 dong to 25,000 dong per liter, it's not because world oil prices increased. It's because the dollar lost value, and Vietnam had to pay more Vietnamese dong to exchange for the same amount of dollars to buy oil. When you see rice, meat, and fish prices rise, it's not because of scarcity. It's because transportation costs and import costs for raw materials priced in dollars have increased. Meanwhile, Americans can still buy iPhones for $999. Don't you see the injustice? Have you ever wondered why the United States can militarily intervene in Iraq, Libya, or threaten Iran without fearing economic consequences? The secret lies in the petrodollar system. This system operates on a simple but brutal principle. Anyone who doesn't play by America's rules will be eliminated. Look at the bloody lessons from history. Saddam Hussein in Iraq declared in 2000 that he would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. The result? In 2003, Iraq was invaded and Saddam was executed. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya wanted to create an African gold currency to replace the dollar in oil trade. The result? In 2011, Libya experienced a color revolution and Gaddafi was killed. Since 2006, Iran has continuously declared its desire to sell oil in euros, yuan, or even gold. The result? Hundreds of brutal economic sanctions from the U.S. These aren't random coincidences. These are lessons the United States sends to the world. Anyone who dares challenge the dollar system will be destroyed. Many people ask why countries don't band together to create an alternative system. The answer is they've tried, but America won't allow it. China, Russia, and Iran have tried to create separate payment systems like SEPs and SPFS, but they're still not strong enough to replace SWIFT. BRICS has discussed creating a common currency, but each country has its own interests, making consensus difficult. Any country that doesn't obey faces color revolutions, economic sanctions, or even military intervention. Here's how the petrodollar system creates an inescapable vicious cycle. Countries need oil to develop their economies. To buy oil, they need dollars. To get dollars, they must export goods to the U.S. High exports lead to dollar accumulation and investment in U.S. Treasury bonds. Investing in U.S. Treasury bonds means financing the U.S. government. The U.S. government uses that money to maintain the world's strongest military. A strong military helps maintain the petrodollar system, and the cycle continues. Don't you see how evil this is? The entire world is financing its own oppressor. The truth that scholars don't dare speak directly, the world has been completely dollarized. This means the dollar is not just America's currency, but has become the global currency. 88% of global foreign exchange transactions involve dollars. 60% of central bank foreign exchange reserves are dollars. 40% of international debt is denominated in dollars, and 57% of international trade transactions use dollars. This means when the Fed prints an additional $9 trillion, these currencies don't just affect the United States, they affect the entire planet. Here's how the United States bleeds the world that most people don't realize. Stage 1 is pumping money and weakening the dollar. When the Fed prints money, the dollar loses value against other currencies, making U.S. goods cheaper, so exports increase. Tourism to the U.S. becomes cheaper, attracting international visitors. U.S. assets become cheaper, attracting foreign investment. Stage 2 is tightening policy and strengthening the dollar. When the U.S. economy recovers, thanks to stage one, the Fed begins raising interest rates. The dollar appreciates strongly. Capital flows to the U.S. to enjoy high interest rates. Other countries lose capital and their economies decline. Stage three is harvesting cheap assets. When other countries face difficulties, their assets lose value. U.S. corporations buy them back at bargain prices. The United States becomes the owner of global assets. This is exactly how they export inflation and import assets. Typical victims include Asia in 1997 when the Fed suddenly raised interest rates. Financial crisis swept through Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, resulting in U.S. corporations buying back Asian banks and companies at 10 to 20% of pre-crisis prices. Argentina from 2001 to now has defaulted 3 times, each default being another harvest of their assets by U.S. investment funds. Turkey in 2018, when the Fed raised interest rates, the lira lost 40% of its value in just a few months. Turkish people had to pay double to buy the same amount of imported goods. And now it's Vietnam. Since 2022, the Vietnamese dong has lost over 8% of its value against the dollar. This means we're paying a hidden tax of 8% on everything imported. Why can't countries resist? The answer lies in their deep dependence on the dollar system. Most developing countries have large debts denominated in dollars. If the dollar appreciates, their debt burden increases accordingly. Central banks hold reserves mainly in dollars. If they abandon the dollar, they'll lose all their reserves. SWIFT is controlled by the U.S. Being cut off from SWIFT means being isolated from international trade. And as we've seen with Iraq, Libya, Iran, anyone who doesn't comply gets democratized. That's why the entire world must swallow inflation from the U.S. helplessly. Have you ever wondered why, even though Vietnam doesn't print money like the U.S., inflation here is still higher than in America? It's because we're bearing exported inflation from the U.S. Look at these undeniable numbers. 2020 Vietnam inflation 3.2%, U.S. 1%. 2021 Vietnam inflation 1.8, U.S. 4.7. 2022 Vietnam inflation 3.2%, U.S. 8.0. 2023 Vietnam inflation 3.3, U.S. 4.1%. Do you see the pattern? When the U.S. pumped money from 2020 to 2021, inflation in the U.S. was low, but Vietnam still had inflation. When inflation exploded in the U.S. in 2022, Vietnam also had to bear similar pressure. The invisible cost that Vietnamese people must bear includes skyrocketing energy prices from 15,000 dong per liter in 2010 to 25,000 dong per liter in 2023, electricity prices continuously rising with global coal and oil prices, transportation costs for goods increasing, leading to everything becoming more expensive. 80% of Vietnam's production raw materials must be imported, all priced in dollars. Dollar appreciation leads to increased production costs, and prices must increase. The state bank must sell dollars to keep exchange rates stable. Foreign reserves depleted, so must borrow internationally. Borrowing in dollars leads to greater dependence on the U.S. Every time the dollar appreciates 1%, Vietnamese families must pay an additional 2 to 3% in living costs. This is a tax you don't even know you're paying. This is the most cunning trap America has set for developing countries, encouraging them to develop export-dependent economies to the U.S. How this trap works: America opens its market, encouraging countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico to produce cheap goods. These countries invest heavily in export production, creating millions of jobs dependent on the U.S. market. Once addicted to exports, America begins setting conditions. If you want to sell to us, you must follow our rules. These countries are forced to accept all conditions to keep their export livelihood. The result is that Vietnam currently has 25% of GDP dependent on exports, with the U.S. being the largest market. This means Vietnam's economy is completely dependent on American moods. The inescapable vicious cycle goes like this: export to earn dollars, use dollars to import raw materials, produce export goods with imported raw materials, export again to earn dollars, and the cycle continues. But here's the scary part. In this cycle, real added value has been sucked away by the U.S. through exchange rate and inflation mechanisms. Specific example: Vietnam exports $1 billion worth of textiles to the U.S., but to produce those goods, we must import $800 million worth of raw materials like fabric, chemicals, machinery from countries allied with the U.S. In the end, Vietnam only gets $200 million in added value, while the other $800 million has flown into other people's pockets. However, no system lasts forever, including America's dollar empire, and signs of cracks are gradually appearing. The rise of alternative currencies like the Chinese yuan has increased from 1% to 3% in global reserves since 2016. The euro, despite facing many difficulties, still accounts for 20% of global reserves and is being used by many countries in bilateral trade. Bitcoin and stablecoins are becoming alternative stores of value, especially in countries with high inflation. The anti-dollar alliance is growing stronger, with BRICS expanding from 5 original countries to 11 countries, accounting for 45% of world population and 35% of global GDP. They're seriously discussing creating a BRICS currency to replace the dollar in intra-block trade. Parallel payment systems like Russia's SPFS, China's CIPS, Iran's CPAM, though not as strong as SWIFT, are gradually improving. Bilateral agreements between Russia, China, Iran, India, Brazil, Argentina are increasingly using domestic currencies instead of dollars in trade. When recognizing the threat, the United States has been reacting increasingly decisively through trade wars, imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, technology bans, forcing countries to choose sides, economic sanctions by cutting countries off from SWIFT, freezing assets, banning banks from transactions, military interventions from Afghanistan, Iraq to Libya, Syria, all aimed at maintaining dollar order, color revolutions to overthrow disobedient governments through protests and coups. But here's the scary thing. The more decisively they react, the more America proves they're terrified of the possible collapse of the dollar system. If the dollar system collapses, what will happen? For the United States, hyperinflation like Venezuela, loss of ability to finance the massive military, sharply declining living standards when unable to bleed the world, possibly leading to civil war due to social unrest. For the world, global financial chaos in the short term, countries must find alternative systems, international trade disrupted, but in the long term, the world will be more free. For Vietnam, short-term shock due to export dependence, opportunity to shift to trade with new blocs, reduced imported inflation pressure, possibility of more independent development. You need to monitor these signals to know when the dollar system begins to falter. Dollar proportion in global reserves drops below 50%. Gold prices surge and maintain high levels. Bitcoin and other cryptos are widely accepted as international payment methods. BRICS announces a common currency with a specific launch date. A major country like Saudi Arabia declares selling oil in other currencies. When 3 of these 5 signs appear simultaneously, that's when the dollar empire begins to waver. After hearing all this, you understand why the United States can print 40% of total dollars in 2 years without suffering inflation. It's not magic, but the most sophisticated exploitation system in human history. They've turned the entire world into economic slaves to bear inflation for them. They've used force and threats to maintain the dollar empire. They've made billions of people worldwide poorer so a few Americans could get richer. But this system cannot last forever, and when it collapses, only those who are knowledgeable and prepared will be able to overcome it. Ways to protect yourself include diversifying assets, not keeping all money in banks in Vietnamese dong, holding some assets in gold, dollars, euros, investing in real estate and stocks of companies with real value, understanding economic cycles, learning to recognize the 4 stages of economic cycles, not borrowing excessively when interest rates are low, accumulating cash when markets are hot, enhancing financial knowledge by reading books on macroeconomics, following monetary policies of the Fed and State Bank of Vietnam, understanding how inflation affects life, creating sustainable income sources by developing skills that won't be replaced by AI, doing business in products and services with real demand, not depending entirely on salary from one company. Most importantly, don't try to play the game by rules they've already designed. You'll always lose. Instead, create your own rules. Invest in education and skills, build relationship networks, research and invest in new technologies. Learn to make money from what you're truly good at. Knowledge is power. When many people understand the nature of the system, they'll make wiser choices. If you find this information useful and eye-opening, share it with friends and relatives. Don't let them continue being deceived by orthodox economic stories that the elite have created. Help them understand that inflation isn't a natural phenomenon. Poverty and wealth aren't due to luck or lack of effort. Economic crises aren't random, but all are results of a system designed to serve a few people. We're living in the greatest transitional era in human history. The old system is wavering, a new system is forming. Those who understand the nature of the monetary game will have opportunities to rise. Those who blindly trust the old system will be left behind. The choice is in your hands. Continue being a slave to the system or become the master of your own life. Remember, they can control currency, but they can't control the knowledge in your head. They can print more money, but they can't print more time and skills. Invest in yourself. That's an investment that never loses value. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow other deep analyses of the economic world. Let's wake up together and build a better future.